Hey everybody, Corey here coming at you with another knife review. Today we have a special little piece. This is the Craig Brown Knives Mini FSD. At this point in time, there have only been a little bit over 100 of these released, and he's about to start producing the 20 CV versions. These ones are in CPM 154, as designated by the 154 right there. But without further ado, let's get into the review. And I want to start this by saying something very specific. This is an $800 knife, okay? So maybe some of you just got turned off by that. Maybe some of you just got more interested. But there's a reason that I'm only going to do two size comparisons on the lower end of the price range. Here's the Ontario Knives Rat number 2, relatively small knife. Obviously, the Mini FSD is coming in larger than that. Here it is, next to the Spyderco PM2. Little bit shorter in overall length than the Spyderco PM2, about a half an inch in overall length. But keep in mind, the Mini FSD is not exactly as mini as it could be. Now, we're going to show you a few other knives in this price range because I have a feeling you might be familiar with these if you're looking at a knife like this. Here it is next to the Koenig Knives Arius. Comes in about an inch and a half. I'm sorry, not an inch and a half, about 3/4 of an inch shorter than the Koenig Knives Arius. Here it is next to a Herman Knives Slim. Again, coming in smaller than the Slim, but the Slim is a relatively large knife as well. Here it is next to the Skiff Made Blades Culprit. Basically about the same exact overall length as the Culprit. Here it is next to a brother of its from the same maker, the Craig Brown Cortex. Actually coming in again about the same overall length as the Cortex. And then last but not least, here it is next to a Holt Knives Morpheus. A little bit bigger than the Holt Knives Morpheus, about a 1/4 inch bigger in overall length. So let's talk about this knife. $800, what are you getting? You got your typical Craig Brown fit and finish here. I would say, for me, this knife is 95% of the way there. And for me specifically, the 5% was two different things, and I've already fixed them. The tip of the blade had a small burr on the very top of it, which for $800, I don't know, maybe you can think about that. Mine did, yours might not. But the other thing, and people have called this out, you might see that I put a mirror edge on this one. These, for whatever reason, have been notorious for not being extremely sharp right out of the box, and mine was no different. So one of the first things I did was put a mirror edge on this. Other than that, from a fit and finish perspective, I have no complaints. This is just about everything that you would expect from a knife at this price point. Although, if I'm being honest, if I'm going to be as picky as I would recommend you be at this price point, I was a little scratching my head about the burr and the semi-dull blade. Now, I just want to point out, again, Craig Brown Cortex right here, this did not have any of those problems. So I don't know what it is. I don't know if the FSD's grinding got sourced out or something like that, but the Cortex is just like the pinnacle of manufacturing perfection to me. We won't talk about the Cortex anymore, though. Let's talk about the knife overall. So, fantastic build quality. What do I like about this knife? What stands out to me? Well, it's one of the only high-end knives that has a lock like this. This is, he calls it, it's something about his name. He calls it the Brown lock or something to that extent. It's his proprietary lock. If you are familiar with knives, I don't want to oversimplify this, so don't crucify me if you don't enjoy my description, but you can see it behaves like a button. To engage it or disengage it, you simply press it on the outside. There's a gap here that makes it look like you need to pull down, but you don't. You are only pressing it. When you press it, it moves what I'm just going to refer to as the liner on the inside, and you can see it snaps into place like that, and then the knife is secure. When you want to let go of it, you press it down, it's now unlocked, and you can let it swing like that. If you're familiar with button locks, Operationally, this is going to perform like a button lock that's on the lock side. Most button locks are usually actuated with your thumb on the show side. This one is easy to actuate with your index finger on the lock side. The only other thing that I can really compare this to, and I don't want to throw this around because they're both proprietary locks, is the Spyderco Smock. If you're familiar with the Spyderco Smock, it basically has a compression lock, but it's reversed in the usual direction of a Spyderco compression lock. The button is on the show side where your thumb is, and it pretty much acts just like this does, except it's on the show side. I don't want to call this a compression lock. I don't want to call it a reverse compression lock. It is the Brown lock. But that's how the lock operates. That's how this knife is engaged or disengaged. And that's kind of the gimmick that's going on with this knife. That's the cool thing that's going on with this knife. Let's talk about deployment methods. It's going to be relevant in a few ways. You have a full fuller, so you can reverse flick it like that. You can obviously front flip it, right? Because you got, let's undo it. You got the front flipper. And then you've got this kind of top flipper. It's a mix between like a top flipper and a conventional flipper, but you can do it like that with your index finger, or you can roll over it with your thumb, just like that. Now, this is the part where I get really, really critical, okay? In my opinion, this knife is clearly suited and tuned for the reverse flick. It is by far the most intuitive. It is by far the easiest way to actuate that action. The jimping here, I'm going to be really critical here. I don't understand. I have never felt more useless jimping in my entire life. It is so smooth. You can see how shallow it is. I mean, it basically doesn't exist, right? I'm not sure if it's just an aesthetic thing or what, but the reason I'm calling that out is for front flipping purposes, it gives you no traction. You really have to kind of push into it to get the grip that you need. And I have a kind of similar critique. The jimping is slightly more aggressive on the conventional flipper side of things, but you still have to hit it at the right angle to deploy it, I would say, easily. The detent on this is a little firm. You can see when I try to slow roll it with my thumb, it pops out like that. And that's just a result of the detent sitting relatively deeply in its hole. But that creates a situation where it requires a little bit of effort to deploy on all fronts, but it makes it really snappy on that reverse flick. Why am I calling this out? Well, this knife is kind of praised as being a fidget king, or its bigger brother was praised as being a fidget king, and it was basically designed the exact same way. But what I would say is, the only thing that really impresses me, if I'm being honest, is the reverse flick with this fuller. The front flipper and the top or conventional flipper, they really feel like they're just there if you want them. But it really feels like this knife was meant to be reversed flicked. So I will say that. In terms of ergonomics, this knife is actually pretty fantastic. But this is just a result of any button lock or any compression lock. You get these wide surfaces here because you're not running into a liner, you're not running into a frame lock, anything like that. And what that means is that when you grab this knife, there are no hot spots. There are no hot spots anywhere on this knife, including the pocket clip, which, oh, by the way, is just absolutely stunning. I love the way the milling is continued from the handle to the pocket clip. And oh, by the way, there's a flat pad under that pocket clip so that it doesn't get hung up on your pocket, whatever the case might be. Wide chamfers on those edges make this knife just an absolute dream to hold. It's really great. That being said, take note that there is no contouring on this knife. This is a flat knife with chamfered edges, as opposed to, dare I say it again, the Cortex, which is actually rounded. It's actually contoured along the top of the entire knife. So this does lend itself to feeling a little bit like a tiny brick, right? A tiny pancake. It's very flat. If you like flat knives, you're going to like this knife. If you don't like flat knives, you might not like this knife. Now, I'm going to say a couple other things. One thing that I notice is that this tip is very, very close. It's so easy to touch that tip, if I'm being completely honest. It doesn't worry me a whole lot, right? Because when it's sitting in your pocket, it's going to be like this, and you're kind of going to be going past it. But I did notice it just when I was checking for some sharp edges that may be anywhere left on the knife. I did notice that I can pretty readily run my finger across that tip. So just something to be mindful of. Now, there's one thing that kind of murdered this knife for me, and I want to emphasize the build quality here is fantastic. This is a very fun knife. It's a very interesting knife, and it's one of the only knives that I'm aware of in this price range that has this many deployment methods and has a fidgety lock like this. If that's something that you're into, this is one of the only options in this price range. Okay, so I just want to get that out of the way. However, when we're talking about actually using the knife, I will praise it for its ridiculously aggressive hollow grind. This is a cutter like nobody's business. I have never seen a hollow grind this aggressive. Okay, so that's very nice. However, while we're talking about usage, there's one thing I want to call out. This button, which is used to operate the lock, is extremely sensitive. It is extremely sensitive to pressure. So much that right now, this knife has no lock rock. But if I just barely touch this lock, I'm going to zoom in, I'm going to get this up close. If I just barely, you see that? About 1/4 of a millimeter, okay? I have a little bit of lock rock now, okay? And that can be fixed if you disengage it and you re-engage it. Now I have no lock rock, but I want to re-emphasize, I'm just barely letting my finger touch this thing. Watch it move. I barely put any pressure on it. It moved, again, 1/4 of a millimeter, and you get a little bit of lock rock. I'm only calling that out because it's almost impossible to deploy this knife and then use it and not bump into that locking mechanism to some degree. This is a conventional saber grip, right? I'm not choking up at all. And you can see I have just barely clearance on that with my average sized hands. As soon as you start moving up this knife, you're gonna bump it. And it is, again, it's so sensitive. You cannot, I don't even want to do it on video because I sharpen this thing. You cannot hammer grip this knife. When you hammer grip this knife, look at this. You see this? I can disengage that. And I promise you, I'm not giving this thing the death grip, okay? Just a conventional hammer grip, and you can disengage the knife. Now, there were some reports of the regular FSD disengaging even when you're not really screwing with the lock. With this one, you do have to touch the lock. You have to bump into the lock. And I wouldn't say that that was a problem under normal circumstances. But given how sensitive that lock is, I don't like touching it at all. Even without a real hammer grip, just bumping it, just resting my knuckle on it, choking up here, not even using the choil, I mean, it disengages. It disengages, and to be quite honest, with something that you're going to want to cut with, I don't know how much you want to be thinking about the lock potentially disengaging in the middle of using the knife. And because this has no flipper tab, if this does disengage, I mean, the blade's kind of coming for you to a certain extent. So, that's my one beef with this knife, really, is the sensitivity of that lock. Overall, it's a very interesting piece, and I can appreciate that Craig Brown is doing something differently, and he's doing something at a price point where nobody else is really participating in this, right? Nobody else has, 3 deployment methods and a pseudo button, pseudo compression lock kind of going on here. It's a sexy knife. It's a very attractive, awesome, cool, elusive talking piece. But when it comes to something other than playing with the knife, I hesitate. I hesitate just a little bit. A lock that is that sensitive and is that accessible, I would recommend that he either recess the lock or he increase the amount of pressure that you need to depress the lock. I mean, it requires just no effort to move that thing, and quite honestly, it feels a little bit dangerous. Let me step away for just a second and show you an alternative. All right, this is going to blow your minds. Here is the EMP EDC Nimble. This is a $300 knife. And I'm not going to get into, oh, is this worth it, blah, blah, blah. But I just have to point this out. You see any similarities here? You got kind of a top conventional flipper. You've got a front flipper. You've got an actual hole, not just a fuller, but a hole. And oh, by the way, this action, glassy smooth. And oh, by the way, it's a frame lock. So as long as you're grabbing it like this, it's really not going to disengage. And oh, by the way, the jimping is more aggressive, both on the flipper and on the front side, right? On the spine when you're trying to front flip it. I'm not going to get into a discussion about, oh, this one's more than double the price, but I think this one, you know, we won't go there. We won't go there right now. However, this is a very cool knife, but I have to say, I'm a Cortex guy through and through. I think the Cortex is some of Craig Brown's best work. It's a little bit more conventional, even though it does have some unique flair to it. It has an interesting opening mechanism and an interesting locking geometry, right? But when we're talking $800, right? Okay. The Morpheus, I haven't done a review. The Morpheus for $875, take a Morpheus any day. The Herman, about $820, I'd take the Herman. The Arius, you know, as a user, as a knife that you actually intend on using, I'd take the Arius any day. And that's another knife that bumps up against that $800 price point. I do not dislike the Craig Brown Mini FSD, but I think there are some critical changes that need to be made to the knife before it would be the kind of knife that I can wholeheartedly say would stay in my collection. Few more finishing touches, no burrs, give me a sharp knife, give me some real jimping, decrease that lock bar sensitivity. He's got everything else down. He's got the sexiness down, he's got the fit and finish down everywhere else. It's got appeal. And again, it's doing something with these deployment methods that no other knife in this price range is really doing. But the setbacks compared to other knives in this price range, I can't justify keeping this forever. I simply can't do it. I want someone else to be able to experience this, and that's how this is going to go. So guys, hope you understand where I'm coming from. Expect to see some reviews of the similar knives in this price range that I kind of flashed you for this video. I haven't shown them to you yet, but I promise they're not all as brutal as this one. I got to give critical feedback where it's due. And I think there's some critical feedback owed for this knife. So again, guys, love you. Hope you found this entertaining. And I will see you all next time.